The air inside the Civic Center hall felt heavy, like it was holding its breath waiting for something to happen. 17-year-old Elise sat on the bench behind the heavy velvet curtain. She was wearing a black dress that was a little too long, brushing against her ankles, and she kept smoothing the fabric over her knees to stop her hands from shaking. This was the biggest night of her life. It was the Regional Youth Talent Showcase, a place where students from 5 different counties came to show what they could do. But for Elise, it wasn't just about showing off. It was about proving something to herself. She had spent the last 6 months hiding in her bedroom after school, practicing the same song over and over again until her fingers felt like they were going to fall off. The song wasn't a famous classical piece that everyone knew. It was something she had put together herself, little pieces of melodies she remembered hearing in the kitchen when she was a little girl. It was a tribute to her mother, who had passed away 2 years ago. Playing this song here, on this stage, was the only way Elise knew how to say goodbye properly. Out in the audience, the hall was filling up. She could hear the low hum of hundreds of people talking, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor, and the occasional cough or laugh. Every time the noise level rose, Elise's stomach did a flip. She peeked through a small gap in the curtain and saw rows of heads. There were parents holding flowers, judges holding clipboards, and little kids squirming in their seats. It was terrifying, but it was also exciting. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to visualize the notes in her head. Do, re, mi, fa, sol. She pictured her mother's hands kneading dough, the rhythm matching the beat of the music. Then, the mood shifted. A man walked onto the stage from the side door. He wasn't a student. He was Mr. Sterling, her piano teacher. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a face that rarely showed any happiness. He walked with a stiff back, his shoes clicking loudly on the wooden floor. He didn't look like he was there to enjoy the music. He looked like he was there to inspect a construction site. Elise watched him walk to the center of the stage. He stopped at the grand piano and ran a finger over the shiny black lid, checking for dust. Even from where she sat, she could feel the tension radiating off him. Mr. Sterling was a man who believed in rules. He believed that music was about math, about speed, and about hitting every single note with the exact same amount of force. He didn't like it when Elise tried to add feeling to the music. He hated it when she slowed down to make a part sound sad or sped up to make it sound happy. He called those mistakes. "You look like a statue," a voice said beside her. Elise jumped and turned to see a younger boy named Toby, who was scheduled to play the violin later in the show. He was tightening the bow on his instrument, looking at her with wide eyes. "I'm just nervous," Elise admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it always this loud out there?" Toby shrugged. "It's a full house. My mom said there are even some talent scouts in the back. People who can give you scholarships." He paused. "Mr. Sterling looks scary tonight. Even scarier than usual." Elise looked back at the stage. Mr. Sterling was now adjusting the microphone stand at the front of the stage, moving it an inch to the left, then an inch to the right, as if the exact position mattered more than the music itself. He adjusted his suit jacket, checked his watch, and looked toward the wings where the students were waiting. His eyes scanned the darkness until he found Elise. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just stared at her for a long second, his expression blank, before turning back to the audience. The show began. A girl came out to play the flute. Elise listened from the wings. The girl was good, very fast and precise, but Elise found herself bored. It sounded like the girl was just trying to get through the song as fast as she could without making a mistake. It didn't make Elise feel anything. When the girl finished, the audience clapped politely. Mr. Sterling walked out onto the stage again to introduce the next act. His voice boomed through the speakers, loud and commanding, making Elise flinch. "Precision is key," he said into the microphone. "Discipline is what separates the hobbyists from the artists." Elise felt a small knot form in her chest. She knew he was talking about her. Last week, during their final lesson, he had told her that her piece was too sentimental. He had told her that if she played it like that tonight, she would embarrass herself and the academy. He had told her to play it exactly like the metronome, cold, steady, and unfeeling. But Elise knew she couldn't do that. If she took the feeling out, the song wouldn't be her mother's song anymore. It would just be noise. More acts went by. A cello player, a trumpet duo, and a choir. With every passing minute, Elise's heart beat harder. She watched the clock on the wall tick closer to her time slot. 8 p.m., 8:15 p.m., 8:30 p.m. She stood up and walked toward the piano backstage, the one used for warming up. She sat down and played the first few bars of her song. Her hands were cold, but the muscles remembered what to do. She closed her eyes and let the music take her away for just a moment. She imagined the smell of her mother's perfume, the way sunlight used to hit the kitchen table in the afternoons. The tempo slowed down, just like she wanted it to. "Stop." The voice was sharp and cut through the air like a knife. Elise's hands flew off the keys, crashing into her lap. She spun around on the bench. Mr. Sterling was standing right behind her. She hadn't even heard him walk up. "You are slowing down again," he said, his voice low and angry. "I told you, rubato is for professionals who know the rules. You are a student. You do not have the luxury of interpreting the music. You play what is written." "But Mr. Sterling," the song Elise started, her voice trembling. "I don't care about your story," he snapped, cutting her off. "This is a competition. It is not a therapy session. If you go out there and play that sloppy, emotional version, I will personally ensure you never get a recommendation from this academy. Do you understand?" Elise felt tears stinging the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She looked down at her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Good. Fix your posture. You look slumped." He turned and walked away, his shoes clicking rhythmically on the concrete floor, leaving her alone in the dark corner. Elise sat there for a moment, trying to calm her breathing. He was wrong, she told herself. He had to be wrong. Music was feelings. If it wasn't feelings, why would anyone listen to it? But the doubt was like a weed in her mind. What if he was right? What if the audience hated it? What if she got up there and froze, or worse, played beautifully but nobody cared because it wasn't technical enough? The announcer's voice came over the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, for our final performance of the first half, we have a special treat. Please welcome Elise Thomas." The sound of polite applause rippled through the curtain. This was it. Elise stood up. Her legs felt like jelly. She smoothed her dress one last time. She looked toward the stage exit. Mr. Sterling was already out there, standing near the piano, waiting to introduce her, or perhaps waiting to judge her the moment she sat down. He looked like a guard standing in front of a prison gate. Elise took a step forward. Then another. She could see the bright lights cutting through the gap in the curtain, blinding and white. She could hear the murmuring of the crowd settling down. It was now or never. She thought about her mother again, not the sad memory of her being gone, but the happy memory of her laughing while she cooked. Elise tightened her hands into fists and then relaxed them. She wasn't playing for Mr. Sterling. She wasn't playing for the judges or the scouts. She was playing for her. With that thought settling in her mind, she walked toward the light, ready to show the world what was in her heart. Elise walked out of the darkness of the wings and into the blinding white light of the stage. It felt like walking into a wall of heat. For a second, she couldn't see anything at all, just the bright glare reflecting off the shiny black lid of the grand piano. The murmur of the crowd, which had sounded like a roaring ocean from backstage, suddenly dropped into a hushed silence. She could hear the soft squeak of her own shoes on the floor and the rapid thumping of her own heart in her ears. She walked toward the center of the stage, keeping her eyes focused on the piano bench. She knew Mr. Sterling was standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, looking like a statue made of stone. She tried not to look at him. She just wanted to sit down, close her eyes, and let her fingers do the work. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times in her head. She would bow quickly, sit, and play. She reached the piano and placed her right hand on the lid to lift it, exposing the strings. But before she could even apply pressure, a hand shot out from her side and firmly grabbed her wrist. Elise flinched and looked up. It was Mr. Sterling. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her skin just enough to hurt, but not enough to leave a mark. He wasn't looking at her with encouragement. He was looking at her with a cold, hard glare that sent a chill down her spine. "Not yet," he whispered harshly through gritted teeth. He released her wrist and stepped around her, moving directly in front of her. He blocked her path to the bench. Elise stood there, confused, her hands hanging awkwardly at her sides. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming uncomfortable. People in the audience started to shuffle in their seats. A few confused whispers rippled through the rows. What was happening? Why weren't they letting the girl play? Mr. Sterling walked over to the microphone stand at the front of the stage. He tapped the metal grill of the mic with his fingernail. Tap, tap, tap. The sound screeched through the speakers, making everyone in the hall wince. He leaned in close, his face looming large on the big screens set up on either side of the stage for the people in the back. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for a brief moment," Mr. Sterling's voice boomed. It was loud, authoritative, and completely devoid of warmth. "I apologize for the interruption in the schedule, but there has been a change in the program." Elise felt her heart stop. A change in the program? What was he talking about? She took a small step forward, intending to whisper to him, to ask if there was something wrong with the piano, but he held up a hand without looking at her, signaling her to stop. It was a gesture of dismissal, like a teacher shushing a student who was speaking out of turn. "As many of you know," Mr. Sterling continued, his voice echoing off the high ceiling, "I have devoted my life to the art of piano. I believe that this instrument is not a toy. It is not something to be treated casually. Tonight, we have a very special young lady who was scheduled to perform a composition of her own arrangement." He paused for effect. A few people in the audience clapped politely, assuming he was about to give a nice introduction. Mr. Sterling let the clapping die out quickly, shaking his head slightly. "While I admire the enthusiasm of our youth," he said, his voice taking on a tone of pity, "enthusiasm cannot replace skill. I listened to the rehearsal of this piece earlier today, and I realized with great sadness that it is simply not ready. The complexity of the music requires a mastery that a student of her age simply does not possess. It would be unfair to her, and unfair to you, the audience, to allow her to struggle through such a demanding piece in front of such a large crowd. Elise felt the blood drain from her face. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. He was doing it right there, in front of everyone. He wasn't just critiquing her, he was humiliating her. She felt her cheeks burn with a hot, intense shame. Hundreds of eyes were on her. She could feel their gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to run. She wanted to turn around and sprint back through the curtain and hide in the bathroom until everyone went home. But her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Therefore, Mr. Sterling said, straightening his jacket and smoothing his tie, "I have made the executive decision to step in. I will be performing this arrangement myself this evening, to demonstrate how it should be played. I believe this is the only respectful way to handle the situation." A low gasp went through the crowd. It wasn't a gasp of excitement, it was a gasp of shock. Elise saw a woman in the front row put her hand over her mouth. A man a few rows back shook his head in disbelief. This wasn't how things were done. You didn't pull a student off the stage at the last second to play the song yourself. It was rude, it was arrogant, and it was cruel. Mr. Sterling didn't seem to care about the reaction. He turned away from the microphone and walked toward the piano bench. He gestured for Elise to move. "Go on," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Step aside. Watch and learn." Elise stood frozen for a moment, looking at the bench that was supposed to be hers. This was her moment. Her tribute. Her song. He was taking it away from her because he thought she wasn't good enough. He thought her feelings didn't matter, that only speed and perfection counted. The anger bubbled up inside her, mixing with the humiliation, but there was nothing she could do. He was the teacher. He was the adult in charge. If she refused to move, she would look like a brat. If she caused a scene, she would be the one they remembered, not the music. Slowly, feeling like her body was made of lead, Elise stepped back. She took 2 steps away from the piano and retreated into the shadows near the curtain. She felt small. She felt invisible. Mr. Sterling sat down on the bench. He adjusted the height, stretching his long legs out, then cracked his knuckles loudly. The sound echoed through the silent hall. He didn't look back at Elise. He didn't offer her a reassuring nod or a glance of apology. He just stared at the keys, his face a mask of intense concentration, as if he were about to defuse a bomb rather than play a song. The audience was restless now. The polite atmosphere was gone, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. People looked at each other, confused by this turn of events. Parents whispered to their spouses. The judges in the front row looked down at their programs, frowning. This wasn't on the schedule. Elise leaned against the heavy metal stand that held the backstage curtains, wrapping her arms around herself. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and wet, but she quickly wiped it away with the palm of her hand. She refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of him. She watched Mr. Sterling's back as he prepared to play. He looked so confident, so sure of himself. He probably thought he was doing the right thing. He probably thought he was saving the audience from a bad performance. He didn't understand that music wasn't about being perfect. It was about being human. It was about sharing a piece of your soul, even if that piece was messy or broken. By trying to make it perfect, he was destroying the only thing that made it special. Mr. Sterling placed his hands on the keys. He hovered them for a moment, fingers poised like a spider about to strike. The room went completely silent. Everyone was waiting. Elise held her breath, part of her hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would play and she would hear something beautiful, something that would make her understand why he did this. But deep down, she knew that wasn't going to happen. He wasn't playing for her mother. He was playing for his own ego. And then, his fingers came down. The music began, loud, fast, and aggressive. It wasn't the gentle, flowing melody Elise had composed. It sounded like a drill. It sounded like a machine. The sound that filled the hall was not the music Elise had practiced. It was loud, aggressive, and incredibly fast. Mr. Sterling's fingers were a blur of motion, striking the keys with a force that made the piano vibrate against the floor. From the very first note, it was clear that he was technically gifted. He hit every single note with absolute precision. There were no mistakes, no fumbles, no hesitations. His fingers knew exactly where to go. But to Elise, standing in the shadows just a few feet away, it sounded awful. It sounded like a machine gun firing in an empty warehouse. The melody was there, buried under layers of flashy, unnecessary runs and trills. It was like he had taken a beautiful painting and painted over it with gray concrete just to make the lines straight. The song Elise wrote was supposed to breathe. It was supposed to have pauses, little moments of silence where the listener could feel the sadness. Mr. Sterling didn't pause. He didn't breathe. He just played faster and louder, as if speed was the only thing that mattered. Out in the audience, the reaction was immediate. It wasn't the kind of silence you hear when people are moved by a beautiful song. It was a restless, confused silence. People shifted in their seats. A man in the fifth row looked at his wife and shrugged, raising an eyebrow as if to ask, "Is this supposed to be good?" A young child near the front covered his ears with his hands because the volume was so harsh. Elise watched the back of Mr. Sterling's head. His eyes were closed, his face tilted up toward the bright lights. He wore a look of intense concentration, his jaw set tight. He thought he was captivating them. He thought he was showing them what a master looked like. He couldn't see the bored expressions on the faces of the people in the back. He couldn't see the woman in the second row who had checking her watch just 2 minutes into the song. He was in his own world, a world where music was just a competition to see who could play the fastest. The piece Elise had written was based on a memory of sitting by a lake with her mother. The left hand was supposed to sound like water lapping against the shore, gentle and repetitive. The right hand was the wind in the trees. When Mr. Sterling played it, the left hand sounded like a hammer hitting a nail, and the right hand sounded like a siren. He completely missed the point. He was so focused on playing the notes correctly that he forgot to play the music. It was like watching a robot recite a love poem without understanding what the words meant. The words were perfect, but the feeling was dead. About halfway through the song, Mr. Sterling went into a long, complicated solo. It wasn't even part of Elise's original music. He was improvising, adding in difficult scales just to show off his dexterity. He leaned into the piano, his body swaying dramatically, trying to force emotion into the song that wasn't there. He stamped his foot on the floor on the heavy beats, trying to create rhythm. It looked painful. It looked exhausting. Elise felt a strange mix of emotions bubbling in her chest. At first, she had been hurt and embarrassed. But as the song went on, the hurt turned into a kind of confused anger. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the music itself. He was ruining it. He was taking something fragile and personal and turning it into a loud, ugly ego trip. She wanted to run out onto the stage and put her hands over the keys to stop him. She wanted to scream, "That's not how it goes. You're missing the soul." She looked out at the audience again. The mood was getting worse. People weren't just confused anymore, they were annoyed. The magic of the evening had completely evaporated. The earlier performances had been full of life and joy, even if they weren't perfect. This cold, mechanical display felt like an insult to everyone sitting there. It felt like a slap in the face to the idea that music was art. In the front row, one of the judges, an older woman with silver hair who had been smiling all night, stopped writing on her clipboard. She took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes, looking tired. Next to her, the other judge, a man in a tuxedo, crossed his arms and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. They weren't impressed. They could hear what everyone else was hearing: nothing. No heart. No story. Just noise. Mr. Sterling, however, was oblivious. He played the final flourish, a cascading series of notes that ran from the top of the keyboard all the way down to the bottom. He hit the last bass notes with such force that he almost stood up from the bench. Then, he lifted his hands high in the air, his fingers spread wide, holding the pose. He sat there for a moment, his chest heaving, waiting for the applause. He expected a standing ovation. He expected cheers. He expected people to be blown away by his superior skill. Instead, there was a terrible, heavy silence. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Someone in the back let out a loud cough. Another person tapped their cane on the floor, a nervous tick. Then, a few people started clapping. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't enthusiastic. It was the kind of slow, polite clapping you give when you don't want to be rude, but you really didn't enjoy the show. It was scattered and died out almost as soon as it began. Mr. Sterling's face didn't change, but Elise saw his shoulders drop slightly, just for a fraction of a second. He stood up and walked to the front of the stage again to take a bow. He was smiling, but it was a tight, fake smile. He looked like a man who was trying to convince himself that he was still in control. "Thank you," he said into the microphone, his voice sounding a bit breathless. "As I said, technical precision is required for a piece of this magnitude." He looked out over the crowd, challenging them to disagree. But nobody looked back at him with admiration. They were looking at their programs, whispering to each other, or looking down at their phones. The energy in the room was gone. It felt flat and dead. Mr. Sterling turned to walk back toward the piano, perhaps intending to play an encore, thinking he just needed to win them over with one more song. But as he turned, the atmosphere shifted again. It wasn't coming from the stage. It was coming from the back of the hall. "Play the right way." A voice echoed through the darkness. It was deep and loud, cutting through Mr. Sterling's moment. Mr. Sterling froze. He squinted against the lights, trying to see who had spoken. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice amplified by the mic. "We came to see the girl," shouted a woman's voice from the left side. "Not you." Elise's heart skipped a beat. She shrank back further into the curtains, her hands trembling. Were they talking about her? That was boring. A younger voice yelled, sounding like a teenager. "Let her play." Someone else chimed in. Mr. Sterling looked flustered for the first time. He smoothed his hair and stepped back up to the microphone, his knuckles white as he gripped the stand. "Please, settle down," he said, his voice losing its commanding edge. "I am the instructor. I was demonstrating the proper technique." It sounded like a typewriter. An old man shouted from the front row. This time, a few people laughed. The crowd was turning. The confusion was turning into something else. It was a sense of injustice. These people had paid for tickets. They had come to support the students, the kids. They didn't come to see a grown man show off. They came to see the human spirit, and Mr. Sterling hadn't given them any. He had given them a lecture in the form of a loud, annoying piano solo. Elise peeked through the curtain again. She saw Mr. Sterling looking around the room, his eyes wide. He wasn't used to this. He was used to students obeying him and parents respecting him. He didn't know how to handle a crowd that wasn't on his side. The polite clapping had stopped completely. Now, there was just a low rumble of angry voices, growing louder like a storm coming in from the sea. He stood there in his expensive suit, alone on the giant stage, looking suddenly very small. The people in the audience weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking past him, looking at the dark gap in the curtains where Elise was hiding. "Bring her out!" A woman screamed, her voice full of emotion. The shout was taken up by others. "Bring her out! Bring her out!" Elise's legs felt like water. She couldn't go out there. Not now. Not after he had just humiliated her. But the chanting grew, rhythmic and powerful. It wasn't just about the music anymore. The crowd was fighting for her. They were fighting back against the man who had tried to silence her. They wanted to hear her mistakes. They wanted to hear her soul. The chanting grew louder, rolling through the vast hall like a wave crashing against the shore. Let her play. Let her play. It wasn't just one person anymore, it was hundreds of voices joining together. The sound was powerful and raw, filling every corner of the room. It vibrated in Elise's chest even though she was standing hidden in the wings. Mr. Sterling stood at the center of the stage, clutching the microphone stand. For the first time all night, he looked unsure of himself. He looked out at the sea of faces, but nobody was looking back at him with respect. They were looking at him with anger and disappointment. He tried to raise a hand to quiet them, to regain control, but it was useless. It was like trying to stop a river with a single hand. "Please, settle down," he shouted over the noise, his voice sounding strained and crackly through the speakers. "This is a formal event. I am trying to maintain the standard of this institution." A man in the third row stood up. He was a big guy with gray hair and a mustache, and he didn't look happy. "We didn't buy tickets to hear you play," he yelled, pointing a finger at the stage. "We came to see the kids." "The girl. Put the girl back on." "Yeah." A woman shouted from the balcony, "We want to hear the song the way she wrote it. Not your robot version." Elise felt her knees shaking so badly she had to grab onto the heavy velvet curtain to keep from falling over. Part of her wanted to stay hidden, to let the curtain swallow her up and never come out. She was terrified. The spotlight out there was blinding, and the anger in the crowd was intense, even though it wasn't directed at her. But another part of her, a small, burning fire deep in her stomach, felt a strange sense of relief. They understood. They knew he was wrong. They didn't care about his perfect notes or his fast fingers. They wanted the truth. Mr. Sterling's face turned a dark shade of red. He smoothed his jacket again, a nervous habit he couldn't break. He looked toward the wings, his eyes scanning the darkness until he found Elise standing there. His glare was sharp, but it wasn't scary anymore. It just looked desperate. He was a man who had lost his power. "Fine!" he shouted, throwing his hands up in the air. He let go of the microphone, which made a loud screeching noise, making everyone flinch. If you want to hear mediocrity, then mediocrity is what you will get. He didn't wait for the applause. He didn't bow. He just turned on his heel and marched toward the side of the stage where Elise was standing. As he got closer, Elise shrank back, pressing herself against the wall. He didn't stop to talk to her. He didn't offer an apology or a word of encouragement. He just stormed past her, his shoulder bumping into hers hard enough to make her stumble. "Don't embarrass me," he hissed as he brushed by, his voice low and full of venom. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the backstage hallway, leaving Elise alone on the edge of the stage. The crowd saw him leave. The second he stepped out of the spotlight, the chanting stopped. The silence rushed back in, but it wasn't the awkward, heavy silence from before. It was a waiting silence. It was electric. Every single person in the hall turned their eyes to the dark gap in the curtain. They were waiting for her. Elise's heart felt like it was going to beat right out of her chest. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling violently. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "You can do this," she told herself. "This is for Mom. This isn't about him anymore." She looked up at the piano. It sat there in the center of the light, looking majestic and waiting. It was just a machine made of wood and wire and strings, but right now, it felt like a living thing. It felt like a friend. Elise lifted her foot. It felt incredibly heavy, like she was wearing a lead boot. She took a step. Then another. She walked out of the shadows and into the blinding white light. The heat hit her face instantly. She couldn't see the audience anymore, the lights were too bright. All she could see was the shape of the piano and the black bench waiting for her. As she walked, she heard a sound. It wasn't clapping, it was the sound of people shifting in their seats, leaning forward, getting comfortable. They were settling in to listen. They were giving her a chance. She reached the piano and stood beside the bench for a moment. The air smelled like dust and old wood. She could feel the vibration of the room. She was terrified, but as she stood there, she realized the fear was changing into something else. It was becoming focus. All the noise, the embarrassment, the anger, it all faded away until there was only her and the keys. She sat down on the bench. It was firm and hard. She adjusted her skirt, making sure she was comfortable. She placed her feet on the pedals. She took another deep breath and looked up at the ceiling, closing her eyes for just a second. She imagined her mother standing right there in front of the piano, smiling with that gentle look she used to have. "It's okay, Elise," she imagined her mother saying. "Just play." Elise opened her eyes. She placed her hands on the keys. They were still cold, but her fingers felt strong. She didn't wait for the crowd to quiet down completely. She didn't wait for a signal. She just started to play. The first note was soft, barely a whisper. It hung in the air, delicate and fragile. She didn't attack the keys the way Mr. Sterling had. She caressed them. The melody began to flow, slow and sad, like water trickling down a window pane. It was the song she heard in her head, the song she had practiced in her bedroom for months. Immediately, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. You could feel it. The restlessness vanished. People stopped moving. The coughing stopped. The rustling of programs stopped. Everyone leaned in. They were captivated. Elise played the opening phrase, her fingers dancing lightly over the ivories. It wasn't perfect. On the third measure, her little finger slipped slightly, hitting a neighboring key. It was a tiny mistake, a clunker that would have made Mr. Sterling furious. But Elise didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She kept playing. And in that mistake, the music sounded real. It sounded human. She played the section about the lake, her left hand keeping a steady, gentle rhythm. She played the wind in the trees, her right hand rising and falling like a breath. She closed her eyes, letting the feeling take over. She wasn't thinking about the notes. She wasn't thinking about the technique. She was remembering. She was remembering the smell of the lake, the warmth of her mother's hand in hers, the sadness of saying goodbye. The music swelled. It got louder, but not harsh. It was a deep, full sound that filled the hall without shouting. She poured all her sadness into the keys, all the loneliness she had felt for the past 2 years. It was a conversation without words. She was telling the hundreds of strangers things she had never been able to say out loud. Out in the darkness, a woman in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. The man with the mustache, who had shouted at the teacher, sat with his arms crossed, a look of deep respect on his face. Even the judges, who had been so bored before, were now leaning forward, writing furiously on their clipboards. They weren't marking down errors, they were trying to capture the magic. Elise played on, lost in the world of the song. She forgot she was on a stage. She forgot there were people watching. It was just her and the memory. She played the climax of the song, a cascade of notes that tumbled down like a waterfall. It was risky and emotional, and it was beautiful. She could feel the energy from the audience washing over her. It wasn't the aggressive energy of Mr. Sterling. It was supportive. It was like a warm blanket. They were willing her on, soaking up every note. They were forgiving of her imperfections because they could feel the truth behind them. They weren't hearing a performance, they were witnessing a moment. As she neared the end of the song, Elise began to slow down. The music became quieter, softer. The lake calmed down. The wind died away. She played the final chords, letting them ring out into the silence, one by one, until there was nothing left but the faint hum of the strings. She lifted her hands off the keys and placed them in her lap. She kept her head bowed, her eyes still closed, listening to the sound fade away. The silence that followed was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full. It was heavy with emotion. She sat there for a long moment, afraid to open her eyes, afraid to break the spell. Then, she heard it. It started as a single clap, slow and rhythmic. Then another joined in. Then another. It built quickly, growing from a patter into a roar. It wasn't just polite applause this time. It was thunderous. Elise opened her eyes and looked out into the blinding light, a small, tired smile forming on her lips. She had done it. She had survived. The sound started as a ripple but quickly turned into a roar. It wasn't the polite, clapping people gave when they were just being nice. It was loud and fierce, echoing off the high ceiling of the hall like thunder. Elise sat on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, her heart pounding against her ribs. She kept her head down for a moment, afraid that if she looked up, the spell would break. She was afraid she would wake up in her bed and realize this was all a dream. But the noise was real. It washed over her, warm and strong. Elise slowly lifted her head and squinted into the bright lights. She couldn't see faces clearly because of the glare, but she could see shapes standing up. One by one, people all over the hall were rising to their feet. The man with the gray mustache was clapping so hard his hands were turning red. The woman in the front row was wiping tears from her eyes with a handkerchief and smiling. Even the judges, who had sat with stone faces all night, were on their feet, clapping in rhythm. She had done it. She had really done it. A strange feeling washed over Elise. It wasn't just happiness. It was relief. A heavy weight she had been carrying on her shoulders for 2 years suddenly felt lighter. She had played the song for her mother. She had played it with all the mistakes and all the emotion, just like she wanted to. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Elise stood up slowly. Her legs were a little shaky, but she held her head high. She walked to the front of the stage and gave a small, clumsy bow. She wasn't a fancy performer. She was just a girl in a black dress. But as she bowed, the applause got even louder. Someone whistled from the back of the room. A teenage boy near the stage yelled, "Yeah. That's how you do it." She looked over to the side of the stage, to the dark curtain where the performers waited. Toby, the young boy with the violin, was peeking out. He was grinning from ear to ear and gave her a thumbs up. Some of the other students were there too, clapping and looking at her with wide eyes. Even the ones who had ignored her before were now smiling. She wasn't the weird girl who played sad music anymore. She was the girl who stood up to the teacher and won. Elise looked the other way, toward the exit hallway where Mr. Sterling had disappeared. She wondered if he was watching. She wondered if he could hear the crowd. Part of her hoped he was. She hoped he realized that his perfect version of the song meant nothing compared to the real thing. He had the technical skill, but he didn't have the heart. The crowd didn't want a machine, they wanted a human being. She took one last bow and turned to walk off the stage. As soon as she stepped into the cool shadows of the wings, her knees finally gave out a little. She leaned against the wall, letting out a long, shaky breath. She felt dizzy, like she had just run a marathon. "You were amazing," a voice whispered. Elise turned to see Toby standing there. He was still holding his violin. "I was so scared," Elise admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought I was going to throw up." "Well, you didn't," Toby said, laughing. "You were better than him. Way better. My dad said he sounded like a robot, but you sounded like, I don't know, like a movie." Elise smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thanks, Toby." She stood there for a few minutes, listening to the applause finally starting to die down as the host walked back onto the stage to announce the intermission. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving her feeling exhausted but incredibly light. She realized she was starving. She hadn't eaten anything since lunch because she was too nervous. She started walking toward the dressing rooms to get her bag. She had to walk past the small table where the judges sat. As she walked by, the older woman with the silver hair reached out and gently touched Elise's arm. Elise froze. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her old fear creeping back. The woman smiled warmly. Her eyes were kind. "On the contrary, my dear," she said in a soft voice. "I have been judging these competitions for 20 years. I hear hundreds of perfect players every year. They play like machines, just like that man did tonight. But you played from the soul. You reminded us why we love music in the first place. Thank you for that." Elise felt tears prick her eyes again. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't ever let anyone take that feeling away from you," the woman said, patting her hand. "Perfection is boring. Real life is messy and beautiful." Keep playing like that. Elise nodded and walked on, feeling like she was floating on air. She reached the hallway where the water fountains and restrooms were. It was crowded with students and parents during the break. As she walked through, people stopped talking to look at her. It wasn't a mean look this time. It was a look of admiration. A girl she recognized from school, usually part of the popular crowd, stepped in front of her. "Hi, Elise," the girl said, looking a bit shy. "I just wanted to say, that was really beautiful. My mom was crying." Elise was stunned. "Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. Maybe we could practice together sometime," the girl suggested. "I play the flute. I think our sounds would mix well." "Yeah," Elise said, smiling. "I'd like that." She walked away, feeling like she had walked into a different world. Just an hour ago, she felt like an outsider, a weird girl who didn't fit in. Now, people were seeing her. They were seeing the real her. She pushed open the door to the girls' restroom to splash some water on her face. As she walked in, she saw Mr. Sterling standing by the paper towel dispenser. He was fixing his tie in the mirror. He looked agitated. Elise stopped in the doorway. Her stomach dropped. She wasn't ready to face him alone. She considered turning around and leaving, but he saw her reflection in the mirror. He turned around slowly. His face was stern, but his eyes looked tired. For a moment, the hallway was silent. Elise gripped the strap of her bag, waiting for him to yell at her, or to tell her she was kicked out of the academy. "They liked you," Mr. Sterling said flatly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "I just wanted to play the song the way I heard it," Elise said quietly, standing her ground. Mr. Sterling stared at her for a long time. The angry look he had on stage was gone. He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I have been playing for 40 years, he said. "I spent my life trying to be perfect. I thought that was what mattered. Tonight showed me something else." He sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to deflate his whole body. "I shouldn't have taken the stage from you. It was arrogant. And it was wrong." Elise's mouth fell open slightly. She never thought she would hear him admit that. "Your music is messy, Mr. Sterling continued. "Your timing is erratic. But it has something I lost a long time ago." He looked at the floor. "You have a gift, Elise. Don't let me, or anyone else, squeeze the life out of it." With that, he walked past her and out into the hall, his head down. He didn't look like a scary giant anymore. He just looked like an old man who had learned a hard lesson. Elise stood there for a moment, letting his words sink in. She turned to the mirror and looked at herself. Her hair was a bit messy from the lights, and her face was flushed, but her eyes were shining. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a musician. She washed her hands with cool water and dried them. She felt different inside. The sadness about her mother was still there, it always would be. But it didn't feel like a heavy stone dragging her down anymore. It felt like fuel. It was the thing that made her music special. She didn't have to be perfect like Mr. Sterling. She just had to be herself. Elise walked out of the restroom and back toward the main hall. The intermission was ending, and people were heading back to their seats. She walked past Toby, who was tuning his violin. He looked nervous. "You got this," Elise told him, giving him a high five. "Just play your story." Toby grinned. "I will." Elise found a seat in the back of the auditorium. She wasn't performing anymore, but she wanted to watch the rest of the show. As she sat down, the lights dimmed for the second half of the showcase. The host walked out on stage. "Thank you for that unforgettable first half," the host said into the microphone. "And thank you to our students for reminding us all that music is about the heart." Elise sat back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. She watched the stage, ready to listen to the other kids play. She knew she still had a lot to learn, and she knew there would be other teachers, other challenges, and other days where she felt scared. But she also knew something now that she didn't know that morning. She knew that her voice mattered. She knew that being real was better than being perfect. And she knew that even when someone tried to silence you, if you speak from the heart, the world will eventually stop to listen.